we will inevitably encounter as a society, as we get more and more ambitious, that climate policymaking gets harder and harder because you encounter these inevitable trade-offs.
Yeah.
So I think this brings us all the way back to the power of a market-based mechanism, the power of carbon pricing as a market-based mechanism, because it has hardwired within it an ability for climate policymaking to seek the most innovative and to seek the most cost-effective ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
That was Aaron Padilla, Manager of Climate and ESG Policy at the American Petroleum Institute, the nation's largest organization representing oil and natural gas companies. Every day, Aaron works with many others to answer a fundamental question. How do we improve our environment while also providing the reliable and affordable energy needed to support America's economy and well-being? And what trade-offs are we willing to accept? This question has become even more important as the nation grapples with how to meet the Biden administration's ambitions to cut carbon emissions in half by 2030. Are dependable energy, economic growth, and the environment at odds? Some would argue they are. But recent climate policy proposals from API and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce show a breakthrough and a more optimistic path for consensus. They join a growing number of voices, from business owners to economists to climate experts, who all agree market-based solutions can bring a triple win: cleaner air, cost savings, and reliable energy. This is Energy Solutions, a podcast from the Electric Power Supply Association, where we unpack the stories and trends behind America's changing electric grid. I'm your host, Todd Snitchler, EPSA's president and CEO. As competitive power suppliers, EPSA members support market-based solutions to allow all resources to compete to reduce emissions at the least cost while providing reliable power generation. This can include an economy-wide price on carbon or a well-designed clean energy standard. In this episode, you'll hear more from Aaron about why API supports carbon pricing. You'll also hear from Marty Durbin, who leads energy policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the voice of American business and enterprise. First, here's Aaron at API. On a day-to-day basis, he's working with API's member companies, staff, and state, federal, and international policymakers to find public policy solutions that advance both climate and energy goals. Of course, Aaron played a big role in developing API's climate action framework. I asked him to share more about the proposal and what went into releasing it. Can you walk us through some of the key elements of the plan and how you envision those kind of working going forward?
Yes, our climate action framework, which we released in March of 2021, is the culmination of a year's worth of efforts in some cases, and some accelerated efforts that we've made in recent months, all to be ready for this moment where climate policymaking is really accelerating, and the expectations of voters and consumers and Wall Street and policymakers and everybody in between on climate change and climate policy is really picking up steam. Our climate action framework has 5 focus areas. The first is all that we do to work to accelerate technology and innovation. The second is our efforts to reduce and mitigate GHG emissions from the oil and natural gas industry's own operations. The third is our endorsement of a carbon price policy as the most impactful instrument that we think that policymakers can use to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The fourth part of our climate action framework is a set of work and policy positions to advance cleaner fuels, both liquid fuels that we use for transportation as well as fuels for electric power generation, for example. Sure. And then finally, the fifth part of our climate action framework is around climate-related reporting and work that we're doing to encourage more transparency and reporting from individual member companies of the API, and ways in which we're working to drive more consistency and comparability for that sort of reporting. And then our whole climate action framework really is meant to show the role that we recognize that we need to fulfill within the natural gas and oil industry to do our part. And it represents some of our best thinking about the ways in which we think that policymakers can approach all of their ambitions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the context of energy and in the context of the role of oil and natural gas in providing energy. So that's the overview of our framework.
So you touched on it a little bit, but why was now the time that API decided to make the announcement and put out this suite of initiatives?
Yes, a lot of our climate action framework and its components are the culmination of a longer effort,
Hmm.
one that has been underway for longer than the political moment that we're in, for example,
Sure.
which certainly informs and catalyzes work that we do in the industry and in trade associations, but it's not the only driver.
Yep.
Um, I think it's evident from the breadth and depth of our climate action framework that we have been working on it for a while. It's not something that we came to very suddenly or instantly. It reflects a recognition within the natural gas and oil industry that expectations continue to accelerate
Hmm.
for action on climate issues, action from policymakers, action from the industry. And it's a recognition that there also is a critical role for the industry, the oil and natural gas industry, to be a part of the solutions that we're all seeking. Many of the expectations that have driven a lot of our work in our climate action framework come from the financial sector, and the ways in which institutional investors and large commercial banks and credit rating agencies and very mainstream ones
Hmm.
have continued to articulate to our member companies their views about the way in which they think that companies need to be well positioned for a future where there needs to be more action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and put us on a trajectory to address the risks of climate change. So we're in part reacting to that in our climate action framework. And then we're reacting to the direction that policymaking is going.
Hmm.
The election of President Biden, continued efforts that have been well underway at the US state level, and then in nearly every other country around the world. There's an obvious need for the industry to rise to the occasion and to be a constructive player in providing our expertise and our input in a credible way to policymakers that are really wrestling with how to be smart at the same time that they're seeking to be ambitious with policies that they want to use to incentivize the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So we're rising to the moment to be able to be a credible and a constructive participant in that policy debate.
We too are under many of the same pressures, although perhaps maybe not as publicly. It's interesting and consistent that both organizations and all of our members are trying to rise to the moment, as you phrase it. I want to kind of drill down a little bit into one of the issues that is kind of a centerpiece of the action framework, which we also have a position on at EPSA, which is that notably the plan includes endorsing a carbon price policy to drive economy-wide market-based solutions. And EPSA and our member companies also see carbon pricing as the most effective and efficient model to achieve those types of emissions at least cost. Can you explain how, in API's view, a well-structured market-based carbon policy would work?
Yes, there are a few key principles that we bring to our point of view about what the best carbon pricing instrument would look like. They are that we think it should ideally be economy-wide in
Mm-hmm.
the sense that it encompasses significant greenhouse gas emissions sources wherever they occur. And that can be across many different industry sectors and can be across many different sources.
Yep.
And so to fully realize the benefits, as you articulated, for carbon pricing to be a very cost-effective and efficient instrument, you want it to be spread across the greatest number of greenhouse gas emission sources so that when there's innovations that help us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in one place and then in another place, where there's the highest potential to be the most cost effective, meaning you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions significantly and at the
Right.
lowest cost, carbon pricing helps for you to incentivize and then realize those gains wherever they can occur. And then the other aspect of carbon pricing that we advocate for is that it really be structured in such a way that can harness the benefits of these market-based mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
You give the market a signal and an incentive to seek and to realize the greenhouse gas emissions reductions where they can be found most cost effectively. And you stimulate innovation over time by putting a price on carbon that makes it possible for us to do greenhouse gas mitigation over time in a less expensive way. And that we have innovations in technologies to directly reduce greenhouse gas emissions or
Mm-hmm.
technologies that stimulate new energies that allow for us to enjoy energy at a lower carbon intensity profile.
Yeah, we certainly share that perspective that the economy-wide approach is the most efficient and effective way to do it. When you segment it, it has the potential to limit its effectiveness. And so certainly we share that modeling as the appropriate approach. How would you respond to a critic or somebody who's a skeptic who says, I don't understand how that fits together? How would you respond to that?
It's a common misperception, I think, that carbon pricing is somehow incompatible with taking meaningful steps toward reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that it's perhaps too weak. Or there's also a misperception that somehow it lets carbon intensive industries like oil and natural gas off the hook.
Right.
These are both misperceptions, and carbon pricing does allow for us to be able to address climate change in an ambitious way. When you have an instrument, a policy instrument that puts a price on greenhouse gas emissions, then that is a very clear incentive to drive innovations to reduce those emissions over time. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage is a perfect example. And this ties right into power markets as well, where a carbon price can likely have a powerful effect in stimulating more development and deployment of CCUS, which, when it's coupled with natural gas used to create electricity, can lower the carbon intensity of our electricity use and help us to maintain affordable and reliable energy and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. A carbon price can also further stimulate efforts that are well underway in our industry to reduce methane emissions associated with the exploration and production of natural gas upstream of power generation.
Yep.
So these are ways in which carbon pricing can be a powerful incentive to reduce the carbon intensity of our use of natural gas for something like electricity production in the US.
How do you see competitive markets, whether in oil and gas and energy or in the power markets world, advancing the ability for us to achieve some of society's objectives, but do so in a way that is cost effective?
Yes, it's a key consideration that you raise, and one that I think we have a role to continue to advocate that policymakers keep right front of mind and right as a top consideration for their choices about the different kinds of policy instruments that they will seek to enact to address climate, and the ways in which we need to seek to manage the trade-offs between reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the cost of doing so, or reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the consequences that that would have for energy reliability and affordability.
Yeah.
I think that we will inevitably encounter as a society, as we get more and more ambitious, that climate policymaking gets harder and harder because you encounter these inevitable trade-offs.
Yeah.
So I think this brings us all the way back to the power of a market-based mechanism, the power of carbon pricing as a market-based mechanism, because it has hardwired within it an ability for climate policymaking to seek the most innovative and to seek the most cost-effective ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. When a policymaker reaches for a more limited instrument where you're picking a winner over a loser, or you're reducing the scale or the scope of the instrument that you're deploying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and only focusing on a certain number of sources of greenhouse gas emissions, these have the risk of moving us as a society toward greenhouse gas emissions reductions that can certainly be significant, but can also be very costly to achieve.
Yeah, we'd certainly agree with that. I guess from a high level perspective from your seat, how do you envision how our members or the power generation community more broadly, even than just the EPSA members and natural gas suppliers and producers can work collectively to ensure that we can achieve many of those objectives?
Yes, I think we can work together to convey to the public and to consumers and to policymakers that there is a whole range of potentially viable solutions here for the challenge of reducing greenhouse gas emissions while keeping energy affordable and reliable. Sometimes the aperture of the options that policymakers and the public think of as the pathways to addressing the risks of climate change within the context of the power sector is too narrow and too limited. Certainly, the greater and greater deployment of renewables, solar and wind and hydro, or very low carbon emissions technologies like nuclear. Certainly, all of these are and should be part of the solution going forward. But the potential pathways to decarbonizing the electric power sector in the US and globally is not limited to just those options.
Right.
We have seen a significant number of dividends in recent years for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector in the United States that we owe to the greater prevalence of natural gas as a feedstock for power generation.
For sure.
Switching to natural gas from higher carbon intensity sources like coal in the US has accounted for 61% of the reductions in CO2 emissions in the US electric power sector from 2005 to 2019.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. That's extremely helpful, and I think a really thoughtful analysis of ways that we can work together to try and address the concerns going forward. API has to find ways for its members to be able to provide safe, reliable, and affordable energy to the nation, including businesses of all shapes, types, and sizes. The Chamber of Commerce recently released a new climate change position that highlights how efforts to reduce emissions can allow American businesses to continue to thrive. Like API, EPSA, and many others, the Chamber says U.S. climate policy should support a market-based approach. Here's Marty Durbin. Marty is a Senior Vice President of Policy at the Chamber, where he leads the Chamber's Global Energy Institute. We really appreciate you joining us, Marty. There's a lot going on in the energy space, and of course, the Chamber is up to its elbows in a lot of those things. And the Chamber, of course, advocates for business and policies that are helpful for business and economic growth at every level. What do you think, from the Chamber's perspective, is needed from the energy side to help businesses thrive?
Well, set energy aside, I think, as you were saying, the Chamber was with across the entire business community. We're looking for Congress and the administration to put policies in place that are going to allow businesses to create jobs, to grow the economy, to innovate in the way that we need to in order to grow this economy, to have both a health recovery and an economic recovery in a really robust way.
Sure.
And all of that, of course, folds over to the energy space as well. The only other thing I would say there, I think what's been kind of a driving mission for the Chamber right now across all of our issue areas is how do we grow a governing coalition? It's not going to be the same coalition for each issue, but we all know that in order to make any kind of progress, we've got to be able to have that governing coalition that provides for more durable policy as well.
Right. We couldn't agree with you more on the durable part, that's for sure. The pendulum issue is problematic when you make 30 and 40-year investment decisions, as our sector of the economy certainly does. So appreciate that. So really the really important news out of the Chamber over the last several months, as I know you were part of that announcement, was the Chamber releasing your landmark new climate position. Key piece of that plan is supporting a market-based approach to reduce emissions across the economy. Sounds very similar to the position EPSA has held, and we put out a year ago in February to make sure policymakers knew where we stood on that. Can you share with us kind of what that means and how you believe that's the right path for the United States looking forward from the business community's perspective?
Sure, and probably worth starting with how did we get there?
That'd be great.
This was the result of a year-long conversation, with our members. I don't want to say members. I just mean GEI. When we launched our task force on climate actions, the whole intent and the point of launching that task force was, how do we now get input from the broad membership? As I mentioned before, there isn't a company out there that isn't now talking about climate sustainability, what have you. Yep. And in fairness, there was a lot of companies, whether it was in financial services, insurance, and other companies that were helping to drive the Chamber to say, we want you to be more forward leaning. I'm also happy to say that our GEI companies were kind of in the same place. Yes, I mean, as you know, oil and gas companies were changing, the power generation industry, your members included, making commitments to, the cleaner energy. But we really had to get to a place of understanding how companies were not only managing and adapting to existing policy, but what were they doing to prepare for anticipated policy that was coming, and where does the chamber need to be positioned so that we not only have a seat at the table, but we're a meaningful voice.
Sure.
Part of our push last year to really lean and get that Energy Act of 2020, the HFC phase down, the resilience provisions. We said we were going to do this, and we did it. We leaned in, we put resources behind it, so we've now kind of built some credibility with friends on both sides of the aisle to say, all right, you guys said you were going to be here, you were. So now where do we go from here? So as we went through the, how far can we go? What can we say? As you said, we ended up with, we support market-based approaches to accelerate greenhouse gas emission reductions across the economy. You won't be shocked to hear that some of our companies thought we went too far. And some of our companies wanted us to go further in the statement itself. Sure. Why not say a price on carbon? Why not align specifically to Paris? Frankly, I think we hit it just right. There was clear consensus around a market-based approach as opposed to a mandates and regulations approach. And we're also very clear, I think it was in the next sentence, that Congress has to act. Getting back to that pendulum swing on policy, we need Congress to say, this is what we mean when we're saying if the outcome is cleaner energy, how are we getting there? And you have to help set the guidelines here and put policy in place that's actually constructed for climate related issues.
And try not to shoehorn things in, but actually have a focused piece of legislation that addresses the issue at hand.
Right.
Yeah. Fair enough. That's very helpful, and certainly seems to be an evolving view that a number of trade associations have made very clear over the last year or so, including the Business Roundtable also has taken a positive position. So we're hopeful, and I'm curious if you share our optimism that policymakers are ready to have the conversation.
Are they ready to have the conversation? Yes. I'm not making any predictions that we're going to see something, in the next few months or what have you. And as we all know, the infrastructure package or whatever, however you want to, phrase it, the jobs plan, all the rest. It's an intended package to include clean energy standard. I'm less. I guess I'm not optimistic that they're going to be able to include a CES in a reconciliation package, for example. I just don't think it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit there. Not to say that there won't be efforts made. And so, but to the point of your question, though, I do think we're seeing more members willing to have the conversation. I mean, to state the obvious, and we've been trying to work with our traditional Republican allies as well. And how do we create a space where they can be part of this conversation? It's not simple, and the hyperpartisan nature of the debate right now doesn't help. But I think it's incumbent upon us to continue to be kind of honest brokers in the conversation. One thing to say, all right, we got this aggressive goal, target, timeline, but we've also got to be willing to say, but is it achievable? And is it, let's focus on what the outcome is, regardless of what the timeline is. This is a point where sometimes I think it's worth going back. You experienced it. I was part of it early on with the hydraulic fracturing and the whole natural gas question.
Sure.
So 12 years ago, did anybody predict that we'd be producing as much as we did? It would have such an impact on emission reductions. Well, the honest answer is no. Nobody really predicted it was going to happen, but there it was. When I was doing natural gas all the time, I would always start by saying we've got to be humble enough to know that while natural gas was a disruptor in the power generation space, something else can come along in the next 5 years, 10 years. And that's why we want to focus as much as we do on having the policy in place that incentivizes the innovation, allows the private sector to then do the commercialization deployment. We don't, and let's be technology neutral on this. let it go where the market says it should go.
Yep. And on that, we fundamentally agree. I mean, the market will get us the outcome you want if you tell it what you want it to achieve. And at the end of the day, our members are innovating and they're trying to deploy the technologies that will move us from where we are to where we want to get to. And having clear market signals is not unique to our industry. It's good for all the chamber members, but that's one of the things that we're certainly looking for. So tell me a little bit about how the policy that the chamber now supports is, how does it fit with reducing emissions and building a low carbon infrastructure? There are critics who would say all this does is make things more expensive in the United States, or the market-based approach to price emissions, no matter what model you use, is only going to make it more difficult for American businesses. How would you respond to that criticism?
Well, I think you got to look at this as the opportunity for American businesses here. I mean, the market is moving this direction already, right? And companies are out there making enormous investments and bets, if you will,
sure,
on the infrastructure, on just businesses moving in this direction. So that's another reason. There's kind of two pieces of the pie here. I think the U.S. has got to put policy in place to help incentivize. It's one thing to say we're going to spend money on R&D.
Right.
We all know, okay, but get to the demonstration projects. Let's figure out financing if there's a need in there. Help companies get through the valley of death, and and all the rest. But the other important factor to keep in mind is the enormous opportunity the U.S. businesses will have in global trade.
Yeah.
Number one, we want to maintain our leadership role in the technology and innovation, but also, as you said before, we're really serious here. This is a global challenge. If the way to solve the global challenge is to make sure that the developing world is deploying scalable and affordable technology, huge opportunity
Indeed.
for the U.S. Business community to be leading and really reaping a lot of benefits from that.
Sure.
But I think this, when we talk about the needing to advance our energy future here, this is an all hands on deck type of issue. So competitive markets, the regulated utilities. I mean, everybody's got to be given the incentives to innovate and put deploy the technologies that are going to provide for the emission reductions in an affordable way,
right.
For the business community and consumers.
That's right. And in the end, your members need to make sure that they can do what they do here. And that input cost is often substantial when it comes to energy. It's right up there with labor. And so making sure that it's affordable is vitally important. And I think you'd probably agree with me that if we could make energy a little less of a partisan issue and a lot more of a common sense issue, we'd probably get our policies effectuated much sooner and with much better outcomes.
I would agree with you 100%. As someone who is fortunate enough to start my career at a time on Capitol Hill when that was, there was nothing partisan about it. Regional, yes, but sure, not partisan. In fact, I remember the staff on the Senate Energy Committee, you could never figure out which party the different staff was with. But anyhow, no, I think that's certainly true.
Yeah. With both the largest oil and gas interest group and the leading business advocate calling for market-based solutions to reduce emissions, we're hopeful to see continued progress. Thanks for listening to Energy Solutions. You can find more information about API and the Chamber's climate plans on their websites, and find more market-based solutions and progress being made by the power sector to reduce emissions on EPSA's website at www.epsa.org. If you like this episode, please share it on social media or with your coworkers, friends, and family. You can also connect with us on Twitter at EPSA News and on LinkedIn. And subscribe, follow, and leave a rating or comment on Spotify, Pandora, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, which bring about 150,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.